be aware, and there's plenty of discussion about that, that some of the quality is a little bit lower and that costs are higher. So that's going to make processors a little bit more reluctant to drop prices down to where the buyers might like them to be. Meantime, raw cashew nut prices in the international market, so this is especially from the point of view of Vietnamese and Indian processors, the raw cashew nut prices that you can buy, cost and freight today, they don't really add up to the kernels prices that you can sell today. Have they ever done that? Well, unfortunately, it's rather rare that there'd be a day where you could buy RCN and sell kernels and make a back-to-back margin. Either you can't sell the kernels because you work in a market like India, which doesn't trade forward, or the international market for kernels doesn't match the international markets for raw cashew nuts. So processors look at it and say, we need sales, RCN is out of line, our costs are high, but sales were good in 2025. Why worry? And in a way, they'd be right. Why worry? Sales have been good, market volumes have been going up. Vietnam had export records last year. West Africa had improved exports of cashew kernels last year, as did East Africa. And the Indian market, the domestic market, was highly buoyant over recent years. Why worry indeed? Let's look at what that leads to. So, off, and it leads to a situation where there's a wide range of prices. Those who really want to sell or need to sell drop their price down toward buyers' ideas. Those who are better positioned maintain prices, maybe 325. I'm talking here about the lowest priced origin, which is nearly always Vietnam. If you were to look in West Africa today, you would tend to see prices much higher than that, $3.45. And for top people, even higher again. What are you paying for there? You're paying for quality, reliability, sustainability. We've talked about those factors in the past. So in summary, on kernels, I see the upside limited by the supply, a good crop, and the downside limited by costs. What about raw cashew nuts? Well, again, if we look at raw cashew nuts, so I better explain this chart. So this is a tracking cost and freight raw cashew nut prices over a long period, more than 10 years, for Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, Ghana, and Nigeria. At this time of year, I don't include other origins because they're not really active. And from that, we calculate a kind of an index. So the index is the red dotted line, and that's a way just to track the market. This is not rocket science, but it does give us a good indication of the raw cashew nut market. So where are we in this market? Well, you can see that prices are higher than they were a year ago. They're about $100. Offered prices are about $100 a ton higher than they were a year ago. And that's despite lower freight costs, at least lower freight costs up to last week. If we look on a longer period, we see that prices are actually at levels that they haven't been since 2019, way back. I think that higher prices probably aren't justified. I think the situation in Ghana, the situation in Benin, the situation in Nigeria has been hyped by traders to make sales. That's what they do. I think it's true that we have to recognize that generally speaking, in major origins, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire particularly, that quality is lower. As I was saying, freight has also been lower this year. That may change now with the events of the weekend. And raw cashew nut prices are out of line with the kernels prices. I calculate that by about 20 cents a pound on kernels. There are potentials for delays in shipments due to policy, but we know these. We know what's intended in Burkina Faso. We know that the government of Cote d'Ivoire, or at least the CCAK, have said that they will not repeat the 2024 suspension again, and probably no need to do that. We know there is a possibility that the window for processors in some countries will be extended, but these are knowns. We also know that the Southern Hemisphere, Mozambique and Tanzania, is well sold, and that material is either with processors or available for processors to buy. And we also know that there is some stocks of raw cashew nuts from last year for sale in Vietnam. Not particularly unusual, not particularly heavy, but nevertheless a factor. If I look at these factors and look at the light volume of trade so far and the fact that RCN is out of line with kernels, and I match that to the fact that the upside on kernels is limited, at least so far it's been limited by the size of the crop, and the downside is limited by cost, I've got to conclude logically, and this business doesn't always operate logically, but I've got to conclude that raw cashew nut prices are overpriced compared to last year and compared to the current kernels market. When they're overpriced, presumably buyers do the logical thing and wait, and presumably prices then would be vulnerable and perhaps slip back a little bit. In this situation, with a large crop expected in Cambodia and a good crop expected in Vietnam, Vietnamese processors can wait. But looking at the chat, I've got to conclude that in India it's different. So I'm saying Vietnam can wait, but India cannot wait to speculate. And there is a danger of being pulled into a speculative bubble on raw cashew nuts, particularly for Indian buyers. That's happened before. It'll happen again, hopefully not this year. Third element of prices is the farm gate. So I decided let's have a quick look at Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, as an example. And what we're seeing here is on the left, the farm gate minimum price in CFA per kilo and in US dollars per ton. And you can see that the US dollar price has moved up and that the CFA price has moved down. That's a little bit different this morning, but the trend is the same. It's a little bit different because the US dollar has got a little bit stronger. Over the longer term, we're seeing farmers, generally speaking, at 400 CFA are happy with the price. Processors, I think, probably need a lower price to make sense of this. They probably need a price between 300 and 350 based on the lower quality. So we are seeing lower quality, certainly lower than last year. I'll come back to that in a minute. And now the appreciation of the US dollar. It is going to be difficult, in my view, for the authorities to defend a price at the farm gate of 400 as the season goes on, based on a good crop, lower quality. What they are doing is they're controlling smuggling. They're trying to control smuggling into Ghana. They have controlled smuggling on other borders. Of course, this means that there's more product available within the country, and this makes it more difficult to defend that farm gate price. So in a way, you could view smuggling as a kind of a safety valve. It dilutes, particularly in the eastern part of Cote d'Ivoire, it dilutes the impact of a big crop. Longer term, we're seeing a trend emerging where as the season goes on, the green line, which is the closing price year on year. So here you've got the opening price, you've got the mid-season price, and you've got the closing price. And you can see that year on year. This is at the farm gate in US dollars. So it is converted to US dollars. And when we look at this, what we're seeing is that the closing price is trending downwards, whereas the minimum price, which is set by the regulator, is pretty steady. So this is an indication that farm gate prices are becoming more and more difficult to defend. And if we look elsewhere, if we look in Burkina, if we look in Benin, similar regimes, similar impacts. So farm gate minimum prices are difficult to defend. That's not good news because it pushes some businesses outside legal trade. We could expect that the same thing will happen this year. So farm gate prices may fall in Cote d'Ivoire, they may fall elsewhere too. Whether or not that's done officially remains to be seen. I think there is a mechanism to do it officially and legally. It would, of course, be very unpopular with farmers. And let's face it, farmers are the weakest members of this chain. and the ones most in need of income. So difficult decisions. Will they do anything? I doubt it. Meantime, don't forget processors are pushing for an extension to their buying window. That's a quick overview of prices. We've looked at kernels prices, raw cashew nuts internationally, and we've taken a quick look at farm gate prices. Conclusion, I think kernels prices on what we know right now and discounting any impact of the war, I think that kernels price is relatively steady. I would be kind of neutral to maybe a little bearish on that. My mind might be changed by the developments of the weekend. We'll come to that. Raw cashew nut prices, I think, should fall. So let's have a look at some of the reasons for those conclusions, and we'll start by looking at production overview. That's a picture of a cashew orchard in Cote d'Ivoire, taken last year, just after the crop had come in. So let's have a look. We look at East Africa, we look at West Africa, we look at Cambodia, we look at India, and we'll try and come to some conclusions. Quick review of East Africa. Yeah, it's definitely going to grow. We will see the 700,000 ton crop at some point that the board spoke about. I don't know if we'll see the million-ton crop that they hope for by 2030, but expect bigger crops. Mozambique, again, the initial estimates, which were very optimistic, they're corrected now. 130,000 tons is a trade estimate, rains in December, maybe reduce the crop from something bigger than that. Maybe it was always going to be 130,000 tons. Again, well sold. Again, longer term, growth is likely to continue, but at slow rates. So East Africa will become more of a factor. Supply in East Africa will grow. There's not an awful lot of product left at the origin for this year. There may be some in the hands of traders and importers, but mostly it's done, and mostly it was a good crop. Let's move on and have a look at just excuse me for a moment. I just need. Okay, back with you. So let's have a look then at Cambodia. Cambodian production has been growing. Obviously, it's been slowing down. You don't get the kind of growth we saw at 2020, 2021. You don't get that twice in a generation, but it is continuing to grow. 2026 doesn't look like there was any extreme weather. The weather is a little bit cooler. There were some showers. More trees are maturing. So those trees, and it's very recent, the growth in production. So trees that were planted are now maturing. Trees are getting towards that 7th year when they start to get to their full production. And some new trees are coming online also. I've no doubt that Cambodia can produce 1 million or more than 1 million tons in 2026. If we look back last year, Cambodia exported 970,000 tons to Vietnam. So maybe last year's crop touched 1 million tons already. It certainly will this year. That's about 2 years earlier than we expected it to happen. Growing conditions have been really good. Prices are high, farmers are encouraged. Maybe it's not as lucrative as they might have expected it to be when they planted the trees, but I don't think there's any reason for Cambodian farmers to be unhappy. They will produce at least 1.3 million tons by 2030. A good crop in Cambodia means that Vietnam's buyers have access to this huge quantity of raw cashew nuts. They can wait before they come to West Africa to do business, but they are buying large nuts, and they are buying nuts that are more suitable for premium markets or for China. They're not buying nuts that produce a lot of 320s, which would be suitable for markets in the Middle East or markets in Europe or markets in North America. Or they have to blend those nuts in with other nuts in order to manage the size and what buyers are looking for. So when we look at Cambodia, it's complicated by the fact that the variety. So it's M23 variety. That's about 80% of the trees in Cambodia now, and it produces high yields, excellent quality, but they're large nuts, and somehow the market has to adjust to that. Cambodia cannot adjust to that. That is the nature of the variety. Let's have a quick look then at Vietnam. Again, a good crop forecast. All the indicators are positive. Production relatively static. We're not seeing any growth in Vietnam. Vietnam imports about 90% of its raw material. But I think the national crop and a good national crop does impact the sentiment. It's around about 325, 330,000 tons, I think. I mean, that's not, it's not a huge factor for a country that imports millions of tons of raw cashew nuts, but it does impact the sentiment in the market. So if we take Cambodia, Vietnam together in terms of production, we're probably looking at 1.35 million tons this year. Imports have been really strong. Imports the highest ever in January, not surprising given the nature of record exports in 2025. People have been looking to replenish their inventories to process now that they're back from the Tet holiday. So if we look at stocks, yeah, there is some 2025 crop. Obviously, what was imported in January is mostly 2025 crop. Some of that will be from East Africa, and some of that material is available. So it seems to me that Vietnamese processors are likely to take their time. They might wait a while before they make decisions. But now there's a certain additional uncertainty on freight and shipments. So that could change the way they look at things. Let's look at Cote d'Ivoire. And this is really the most interesting situation, I think, of all countries at the moment. First of all, we've got strong growth over a long period. Cote d'Ivoire, one of the fastest growing producers in the world. Second fastest in Africa behind Tanzania at the moment. The official crop forecast is 1.6 million tons. That includes, if I read the statements right from the CCRK, that includes the impact of a clampdown on smuggling. The season was opened 1 month later, and that's critical. We saw last year with an early opening to the season that quality was really excellent. People were buying £50 out turn at this time of year. They were buying it in February. This year, it's much different. Now, that's partially an impact of a later opening to the season. It was opened later for administrative reasons, as I understand it, and that's unfortunate. So what we're seeing now is the first crop is lower quality and lower quantity. That's not saying that it's a poor crop. It's just less than last year in both aspects. The quality has been inconsistent. Outturn, what I hear in terms of outturn is a range between 45 and 49 pounds. There is a lot of local variation, and that appears to be due to the impact of a changed harmattan, which is probably an impact of climate change. Some areas got too little rains, some areas got too much, some areas got them at the wrong moment. The second flush or the second crop is expected to be better in volume and quality, and that's beginning to happen now, and that is the evidence I'm hearing. This is the main producing period. But of course, it is, as we say, a wet crop. It rains during the harvest, and so the pattern of rainfall can disrupt production. So we're still thinking now that this crop is going to be a big crop. Maybe not 1.6 million tons, but we don't think much less than 1.4 million tons, which is, close to record crop. It's very important to bear in mind that when we make simple comparisons to last year, we have to remember what we are comparing to. Last year was an exceptional year for quality in Cote d'Ivoire for the reasons I've mentioned, not only the weather, but when the season opened early and processors were able to access raw material earlier in the year. It was always unlikely that the harvest quality of 2026 would match the harvest quality of 2025 once that decision was made. That decision being to open the season later. At this moment in time, Prices seem to be holding relatively steady at the farm gate. Significant buying has been done by processors. It's only processors who can buy at this time of year, by the law at least. Processors would like the window extended. They would like the window extended beyond the March 15th deadline. I think that's possible. I'm not sure it's necessary, but I think it's possible. Um, which means that shipments of raw cashew nuts will be delayed somewhat. I'm not sure that at the current market price, I'm not sure that that's a reason to go chasing RCN. Let's look at India. I want to have a quick look at India because India is the biggest market in the world. We shouldn't forget that. Good weather conditions. Crop is currently forecast, private forecast, to reach 2025 levels, which wasn't a bad crop at all. High prices in those states where trading has already started, but longer term production is static and the Indian rupee has been weaker in recent weeks against the dollar. Most currencies have. Consumption in India, and this is a real point, I think. Consumption in India is increasing by between 5 and 7% every year. That means somewhere between 100 and 130,000 tons of extra raw cashew nuts is needed every year. That means to me that India is likely to buy relatively early and to continue buying for import. As long as Indian cashew consumption, and we'll talk about that a little bit later when we come to the demand side of the equation, as long as Indian cashew consumption remains strong, India's going to need to import more raw cashew nuts. As you can see, despite a good crop last year, a poor crop in 2024, we're not seeing any real strong trend. Now, the government of India would like to change that, and they would like to reduce the dependence on imports. That may happen, but it's not happening anytime soon. That is something that takes time. So, continued good demand for raw cashew nuts from India. Timing of purchasing, more difficult to estimate. I think Indian buyers like to buy Ghana quality, they like to buy Benin quality, even though they can't buy it from Benin, in theory at least. High prices in those states that have started to harvest, generally positive looking situation. Let's have a look at West Africa. So more broadly, and there's a lot of countries in West Africa, so let me just touch on each one. In Nigeria, it looks like a very good crop. I spoke to a couple of people yesterday. There was early flowering, mixed rainfall, farm gate prices are high, export prices are high. I think it's a little bit hyped. It's a little bit controlled. I'm not sure if it'll make that. And of course, now you've got the high quality from some areas of Nigeria, much lower quality from other areas, and there's a price differential there. You've also got an increasing trade across the border from Benin, which is exported through Nigeria. Speaking of Benin, forecast for the crop there is up 12%. I haven't heard as many quality issues in Benin. Now, that may be just that I haven't heard them, but I haven't heard quality issues there in the way I've heard them in Ghana and Ivory Coast. Export ban remains in place, in theory at least. There are price variations on quality, and smuggling is rampant. Smuggling through Togo, smuggling through Nigeria is rampant. That's what happens when you introduce wholesale export bans. If we look at Togo, production remains unclear. Why does it remain unclear? It remains unclear because so much material flows through the country. So I read estimates of 25,000 tons. I read estimates of 40,000 tons. 40,000 is the official figures. I'm hearing, I think, even 45,000 tons from one. They've increased the export tax by 2.5 times. This is a big increase in the export tax. And that will have an impact in Togo, but it will also have an impact in Benin. How do you manage export tax on product that you import? Transit product. I'm not sure how you do that, especially when the origin that's put on the bill of lading might not exactly correspond to the real origin of the product. So an issue there that might slow down export trade. Looking in Ghana, So Ghana's been in the news, and Ernest has spoken about that, and we've seen some real misinterpretation of the worthy ambition of the Ghanaian government to process more cashews and retain more value addition in the country, but not with any dramatic moves of export bans or other regulatory issues. What are we seeing? Well, we're seeing that early crop was impacted by the weather. We saw that the quality was variable. It was really interesting that you would get variations in quality from place to place. I saw some nuts, I saw some pictures of nuts rather that looked really shockingly bad, but then when you did the cutting test, they didn't look too bad at all. The outturn was quite good. Now, if you're a processor, you can manage that. If you're an export trader, it's very difficult to convince your customer that these nuts that look wrong color, that look old, that they are actually, when you do the cutting test, they're good quality. That's a tricky situation. We see a wide variation in the farm gate price. The minimum price was set, I think, at 12 cedis this year. The market is traded, it's traded below 10, but generally speaking, 10, but also as high as 14. I presume that's quality. I'm not sure that 14 cedis is good value right now. I'm not sure I'd pay that price if I were a buyer. It does appear that the problem of quality is somewhat eased during the second crop or the second flush, and that probably will mean better quality for the rest of the season. So in Ghana, it's well worth keeping an eye on the situation. The crop doesn't last very long. It's normally bought very quickly and shipped, but we will see continued transit trade. We probably will see in time the introduction of some export taxation in Ghana, which hopefully will be used to develop the sector. And we will see some incentivization of investment in cashew processing. But Ghana is a pretty difficult place to invest at the moment simply because you've got very high quality, which is in demand for export in a normal year. You've also got huge transit trade through the country. This year, you've got some older nuts coming in from Cote d'Ivoire, last season's crop, which may be mixed by some, not by all, but by some. And you have, on the other hand, quite a good, generally speaking, quite a good investment environment. It'll be interesting to see how processing develops in Ghana. It is encouraging to see some, at least for me, it's encouraging to see some announcements on policy and some developments there. It's unfortunate that people pick that up so inaccurately. But or should we be surprised that that happens in our business? Not at all. Let's have a look at Burkina Faso. The farm gate price is unchanged, 385. Forecast crop about 200,000 tons. I think that probably includes some transit material that comes through the country. There's a processor buying window until the 1st of April. People have talked about actions in Burkina Faso to ban the export of raw cashew nuts for a protracted period. I don't see that happening. I think that there is a month now for processors to buy. They will do that. They did it last year for the most extent, and it wasn't productive. The ban, the kind of artificial ban on exports wasn't productive last year for farmers in Burkina Faso, nor for processors there, and certainly not for exporters. So hopefully processors can get their business done and exports will continue normally through Togo or through Ghana. The introduction of, or the increase in the tax through Togo will be an interesting complicating factor on how that's managed. In the Republic of Guinea, looks like interesting discussion with one or two people. It looks like production growth has settled there. It looks like around about 150,000 tons is the level of production. We are hearing that this crop is forecast to be a good crop. We will be looking for updates. That'll be coming around about mid-March, I think, when we get a better idea. But looking at the situation, looks like a reasonable crop. Maybe not as encouraging in Guinea-Bissau. It is early, probably too early. There have been kind of unusual rainfall patterns earlier. Now, maybe they were too early to affect the crop. That's my guess. But I think we just reserve judgment on that for the time being. Guinea-Bissau is an important exporter of raw cashew nuts, probably in the region of 300,000 tons last year. So it is significant and it's high quality material. And economically, it's really important for the people and the economy of Guinea-Bissau. Overall, West Africa, what do I think? Well, I think on the optimistic side, this this crop could be up about 3% on last year in volume. But if I then factor in lower quality, particularly in Cote d'Ivoire, a little bit in Ghana, I think on my pessimistic side, I'm minus 6%. Is there any big crop movements? I don't think so. I think overall in West Africa, a decent crop, maybe not quite as big as last year, but certainly enough to meet demand. So the production outlook then, the way I'm seeing it now, we're still early. We're still in the early days of March, so there's a lot to happen. But I think crops similar to last year's range overall in the world, somewhere between +2 and -6%, nothing too dramatic. General production trends are positive. Obviously, we have to watch for the weather conditions in West Africa, particularly rain, but we are looking, I think, at a lower quality in West Africa. So West Africa is really important for the production of cashew nuts in the world. Don't forget about 60% of the world's cashews grow in Africa. So we need to keep an eye on that. And the lower quality, but certainly it's going to influence outturn. So it may overall influence the availability of kernels. Cambodia likely to produce 1 million plus tons. I don't think that's any big news. Vietnam and India likely to produce good crops. Longer term trends, and we need to keep an eye on them, indicate fast growth. We are certainly looking at production growing quickly over the coming years. We know this because we know the trees that are planted. We know there may be some weather disruptions, but we will probably see a 6 million ton crop this year, and we could see a 8 million plus tons crop by 2030. We're in the realm of big numbers. So small increments lead to huge changes in availability. Keep an eye on policy. Keep an eye on short-term changes in regulation and policy. There is a risk still that some countries will change their management of the sectors in the short term. Particularly keep an eye on Burkina Faso and Cote d'Ivoire. I think those are the two countries that might make changes. And most of all, and I'm going to say it again, beware of some of the stuff that's coming out. Some of the stuff, it looks great. It looks like it's the truth, but it's not. The numbers are often well out of line. Some of them are well-intentioned. Others are efforts to manipulate the market. So beware of what you see. I see some of the stuff on LinkedIn lately is really quite worrying, and on other social media. I hope you don't need me to tell you that, but I'm going to say it anyway. So that's production. I'm still positive on production for 2026. A bit concerned about quality in West Africa, but I think generally speaking, this is going to be a decent crop. Let's have a look at the other side of the coin. Let's have a look at consumption and the cashew kernels trade. So let's just think about a few of the major factors. We've seen a slow start to buying, especially in forward markets, but also in China. It looks like China has been taking a little bit of a breather. Last 10 days, we've seen more buyers in the market, but generally speaking, just under the market price. Supermarket tenders taking place in Europe. We've seen a slow end. Now, that might be an influence on the speed of buying or the stance of buyers, the relatively slow end to 2025. Now, 2025 was a bumper year for demand, make no mistake, but it ended up a little bit slower in Europe, maybe even a little bit slower in China than might have been expected. I think the price stability of 2025 is also a factor. It makes buyers a little bit more relaxed. It makes them wait their moment. It makes them have a look and see if the crop is going to have the influence on prices that they might be hoping for. But we also have factors in the US. We have the US major buyer of cashew kernels, imports well down last year. The state of the US economy, particularly consumer demand, but also consumer trends, the impact of tariffs, not only on foodstuffs, but on a whole range of products, is looks like it's had a bad impact on the consumption of food products. And of course, the expectations of a big crop. So, from a buyer's perspective, from the demand side, there's have been plenty of reasons to wait or to pitch your prices a little bit beneath the market to see if the sellers come to you. So let's look at some of the numbers. So here's a chart of world imports and consumption. So it's imports for almost everywhere and plus India's consumption figures. And we see relatively strong trend. You know, if consumption was growing at 4.75% and production was growing at the same, you'd be looking at a very interesting market. The problem we face is that production is growing much faster than consumption. As I said, somewhere around about 7% per annum. And that could be a problem. But consumption is growing. The growth is somewhat erratic. Even on the total figures here, you can see the influence of COVID, 2020, then a big spike in demand, then 2022, inflation and war, virtually no growth, and then strong trends 2023, 2024. Then we lose the US market in terms of growth in 2025, but we gain huge growth in China. So this kind of erratic growth makes the market quite difficult to read. It potentially makes it more volatile. But on average, I think what we're saying is that we're seeing a couple of factors. We're seeing on average, consumption is growing more slowly than production. Not everywhere, but on average across the globe. We're seeing a shift to Asia, so strongest growth rates in India and in China, and that may be followed by other markets. We've already seen up to 2025 that West Asia, which would include the Gulf states and Central Asia, we've seen fast growth rates in many of those markets. And we've also seen, and we are seeing today, again, the influence of prices in terms of price stability last year and price volatility before that, and politics and tariffs, conflict. This is having a high influence. So I'm going to have a look at specific markets. I'm going to have a look at the US market, the European market. We have a quick look at India, and we'll finish by having a look at Central Asia, the Middle East markets, because those are important markets and highly topical today. So the US market, so here we have in the US market, the total imports is the black bars. The goldy color is the natural cashews, and the blue, well, that's the imported processed cashews, which has been quite steady. So the US market was growing slowly. If you go back to 2013, all the way along, growing slowly, even grow during COVID, spiked in 2021, corrected in 2022 as inflation came in. Big imports in 2024. Last year, US imports of natural cashew kernels crashed up by almost 29%. So we have seen a major turnaround in the trends in the United States. Processed imports continued to grow, but as you can see, it's a relatively small proportion of the total figure. Let's dig into that a little bit. Let's stand back from that and have a look at. So when we stand back from US imports, what I did was I had a look and I said, what were the average imports between 2020 and 2023? So that's 4 years. That includes COVID, post-COVID spike, problems of 2022, back to a slightly better year in 2023. The average import, 187,000 tons per year. Then we look at 2024 and 2025. Now, 2024 was an exceptional year. Heavy imports, possibly ahead of tariffs, possibly speculation, possibly a misread. It's really difficult to figure that one out. The difference between the two averages, 2020 to 2023, those 4 years, and the 2 years, 24 and 25, is actually an increase, 5.7%. So maybe what we're looking at is volatility, but let's have a look at some of the other factors too. COVID spike, 2022, war, inflation, energy prices, loss of confidence, second half demand collapse. 2024, big increase, 24% increase in imports. Was it stocking ahead of tariffs? If it was a brilliant move, as it turned out. Don't know for sure, but I think it was. And 2025, higher market prices. So 2024 had the two things. It had lower market prices and it had the prospect of import tariffs. 2025 had higher market prices kicking in, and it was big because we saw that 30% increase from April 2024 to the end of the year. And of course, then in 2025, we had tariffs. Initially, we didn't know what levels they were. They settled to around about 10%, and then they were removed in November. So this resulted in a number of things. It resulted in a conflict between importers and their customers. Who's responsible for tariffs? Importers certainly couldn't afford to pay those tariffs. Their customers may have seen that demand would be less and they didn't want to pay the tariff cost, naturally. Uh, that led to conflict, not a good position. Secondly, for the most part, if you speculate, you don't tend to pass the benefits on to your customer, but you do tend to try and pass on the bad news, which is the tariffs. Again, complicating the relationship, making business more volatile, making it more difficult to finance too. Meantime, you need to put in place import bonds to cover tariffs. You will have paid tariffs. You might hope to get that money back now. Good luck with that. And that has a significant impact on cash flow. So what we're looking at is coming into 2026, probably a decline in the relationships, certainly a decline in confidence, undermining of consumer demand in the United States, and then the prospect of, well, are we going to have more tariffs? Is the US government going to introduce blanket tariffs? They've been told they didn't have the authority to introduce these tariffs, but now they've put in something else. Now, tariffs do not apply to cashews right now, let's be clear, but there's an uncertainty around that. So the impact of all of this on the economy, so consumption of certain food products, especially high-end food products in the United States, is significantly down. Consumption of alcoholic drinks is significantly down. Don't forget that consumption of tree nuts is often linked to opportunities that are related to having a drink, having friends, social setting. That can impact consumption. We also have other factors. We have the introduction of these weight loss drugs, which are highly present in the US. Question I need to ask is, are we seeing a change in the consumption trend in the United States? Will we ever return to the levels that we saw of 2024 or even 2021? And right now, you would have to conclude that we will not. You would conclude that the people who were in love with cashew nuts during the 1980s and 1990s got older. Their next generation discovered cashew nuts as a low-cost, healthy product, but now they're finding that they have less money, there's more inflation, and cashew nut prices are higher. So it may well be that this consumption trend has been reversed after 60 years. Let's look at the EU market, where the news is a little bit more positive. So over the last 5 years, the European market has grown at about 5.3%. The longer term trend is 6.3%. It is growing quickly. This is fast growth. For any mature market, this is fast growth. And we've seen steady demand. If you look at 2023 to 2024 and last year, this is pretty spectacular growth. So the future of cashews in Europe, this is the EU 27 countries plus the UK. It looks secure and it looks pretty exciting, actually. And if we take into account that there are strong growth rates in Eastern Europe, and those may well be likely to grow, countries like Poland, we could see strong growth to continue for some time. That will be affected by price volatility. So if we get price volatility, growth will slow down. If we get stable prices, and it's not so much the level of price, It's much more the volatility. If you've seen us during last year, we did an analysis on growth in consumption versus price volatility, rather than growth in consumption versus price level. So if the market were to stay at $3.50 for 5 years, I think we'd see very fast growth. If the market were to go from $2.50 to $4 in that period, even if most of it was at $2.50, I don't think we'd see fast growth. Volatility is important. Businesses need to plan. In Europe, they sell forward. Where do Europeans buy their cashews? And I think this is becoming more and more interesting. We still buy 72% of our cashew nuts from Vietnam. The growth rate for imports from Vietnam still remains steady. It's 3.7%. But the growth rate from African countries is much faster. So growth rate of European imports from African countries is 22% over the last 5 years. And from Cote d'Ivoire, it's 33%, even faster. But in 2025, and I don't think this is to do with the European market so much as to do with some African countries, if we exclude Cote d'Ivoire, which grew rapidly, what we see in other countries is a major decrease in imports. A major decrease in imports from countries like Ghana, Benin, Nigeria, Mozambique. Processing countries that previously had positive trends. So overall, what we see in Europe, we see an increasing market share. It's grown from 7.3% in 2020 to 22% in 2025. This is really good news. But most of that is from one country. Most of it's from Cote d'Ivoire. And you can see the orange line tracking the overall import trend. So this is interesting, positive, but I would say somewhat alarming for other countries. Now, what can they do about that? That, I think, is about finance. It's about the three M's, as I call them. Money, particularly working capital, management of the factories to meet European buyers' needs, and marketing, how you tell your story, how you talk to buyers, how you develop. And these are the three factors, I think, that processors, often approaching the business as a trader might, come to the conclusion that, look, let's just go with Burma kernels because it's easier, it's cheaper, and we know how to do that much. And by the way, there's no selling on it. This is just another commodity. But it's not the full story, and it's a very risky business because at any moment, Vietnamese processors may get tired of importing Burma kernels. It's a single market. It can only really go to one place. Trends in Europe are still strong. All of these trends, I won't discuss them in detail today. We've talked about them before, but all of these trends are strong. So when we look at the European market, think about traceability, think about responsibility, think about SPETA, for example, audit, certification. Think about some of the trends in that market and how processors can make use of that. And this is particularly relevant for African countries where we've seen this reversal in sourcing from countries outside of Cote d'Ivoire last year. Europe, overall positive trend. Generally speaking, European buyers appear to be open to new origins, but they still buy most of their cashew nuts in Vietnam. What about the big story of 2025? What about China? And what about this remarkable increase in imports? If we look at last year, just blows away all records, but it is part of a longer term trend. Now that trend is not always linear. 2022, just like everywhere else, we saw a drop. 2020, COVID, we saw a drop. As far back as 2016, we saw somewhat erratic growth in China. So it's a complex market and there are a lot of factors in play. Imports in 2025 were up by 34%. The 5-year average is 16%. That's really strong. Import was up by 47,000 tons. That's big. I mean, we're talking about more than 200,000 tons of raw cashew nuts. Equivalent. It is mostly kernels that are imported, But on the other side, imports of almonds and pistachio, particularly from the United States, were down, and they were down by 107,000 tons. This might show that while we're seeing some transference and some growth for cashews, the overall health of the market is not as positive as it might appear if we just looked at cashews. So I think this year imports will continue to grow, but they'll grow at a slower pace. There will continue to be good demand for Vietnamese and Cambodian, and mainly Cambodian, Burma kernels. Whether they're processed in Cambodia or Vietnam remains to be seen. The import duty, the 7% import duty on African products, and cashew kernels in this case, is set to be removed. When is not entirely clear, but it will open up opportunities. But whereas buyers in China might be open to the idea of buying from different origins, it's going to be tough to compete on price with Vietnam. So the removal of the duty will help, but there's a lot more to be done. And I don't think we should imagine for a moment for African processors that China is going to be the answer. Vietnam will continue to dominate based on its efficiency, based on the long-term relationships, and based on its price-quality mix. What about India? So India is the biggest market in the world. 1 of every 3 cashews consumed in the world is consumed in India. And as you can see, the trend is really positive, interrupted only by COVID. And if you want to go back a long way, by the financial crisis back in 2009-10. In terms of its scale, its quality, and its pricing, India is very different to any other market. Fast growth, fast long-term growth. High quality, diverse applications, and new applications. Cashews are deeply entrenched in consumption of food products, not only in snacking, as in other countries, but also in the basic culinary practices. So cashews, cashew paste, cashew meal, cashew flour, as well as whole cashews and brokens are used throughout Indian industry. They're used for sweets, they're used for cooking. There's a whole range. Pricing in India is higher than elsewhere. The market is protected. The market in India is a premium price market. It's a very high quality market, first of all, and Indian consumers know a good cashew when they see one. Prices 20 to 30% above the world market. That's partly due to quality, but more due to the fact that the market is protected by high levels of import tariffs that essentially act as a ban on the import of kernels. You'll often see people talk about smuggling and illegal imports. Yeah, sure, they happen. But this is a market of 400,000 tons of kernels. It doesn't make a big difference. India continued to grow in 2025. I think it will grow in 2026 based on sheer demand factors. I think it's about 100,000 tons of RCN extra needed every year. That will increase, of course, as we get to bigger and bigger numbers. Look out for the impact. So we have a trade agreement between the United States and India. The United States is a major supplier of tree nuts for India, almonds and pistachio nuts. But following the imposition of the blanket, I said 10 or 15% tariff by the United States, the Indian government has suspended the discussion. That may turn on again, it may not, which could mean that the tariff situation will change and that there will be tariffs on tree nuts again. Not to mention that the source of Iranian pistachio nuts may also be compromised for sadly obvious reasons. Cashews have been mentioned in the union budget. I think that might be the first time. This is a major move forward, and this will lead to longer term support for production. We've discussed the production and imports and the high dependence in India on the import of raw cashew nuts. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Indian consumers want to eat cashew nuts. They need cashew nuts, and they have to get them from somewhere. At the moment, they import them. Indian farmers might benefit by growing more cashew nuts, but it's going to be a long-term project. It's not going to impact supply and demand in the next 3 years. Maybe after that it could. Those are our major markets, but let's have a look at the markets of West and Central Asia, that some people might call the Middle East, and there's various names for the regions. So this market consumes about 11.5% of world imports of cashew nuts. It's a big market when it's combined. Key countries would be Saudi Arabia, UAE, Iran is important, and Turkey. And then smaller countries will be Israel, Lebanon, and so on. And if we look at this, this has been a fast growing market. It has been a market that has tended to trade short term, so it doesn't have large stocks. And it is a market where redistribution, so redistribution through Turkey and redistribution through United Arab Emirates, is essential for the functioning of the regional markets. And that isn't happening at the moment. So these are important markets, and these are markets that are currently highly disrupted. The disruption is in the month of Ramadan, which will be a month when you would expect imports to be quite strong for consumption toward the end of the month, particularly. So this is a problem, and this could significantly impact world demand, but it could impact 11.5% of world imports. More widely, we need to look at the impact of war, and we need to look at what happened in 2022. So the immediate impact of the war in the Middle East is higher energy costs. Gas prices are at their highest today since Russia attacked Ukraine back in 2022. We're looking at higher freight costs, certainly evolving higher freight costs. We're looking at longer transit times as vessels are diverted around Southern Africa. And we're looking at energy costs. And the point about energy costs is that they don't just impact the price of the petrol in your car or your truck. They don't just impact the cost of home heating. They impact all products. Masses of products produced all over the world are impacted by the cost of the energy needed to produce those products, and of course by the cost of the fuel needed to move those products to where they're needed. So in a global market, and we saw this, if you think back to COVID, or if you think back to when I think it was the Ever Given, the container ship that blocked the Suez Canal, think back of that, and we're back in that situation again. So back in 2022, that led to inflation, it led to a loss of confidence, and it really impacted our markets. So what happened to cashew nuts in 2022? I'm going to give you a couple of examples. First example is European Union and UK imports. So first half of 2022 was rather like 2021. You can see the columns. Maybe we'll zoom in on that a little bit. So month by month imports, blue bars 2021, red bars 2022. So not a bad start, big January, going quite well. The war started 4 years ago in Ukraine when Russia invaded. Second half of the year, we saw a real change in the European Union. Imports in the second half of the year, July to December, were down by 8%. And so you can see July, August, every month was below the equivalent month in the previous year. That was an impact of higher energy costs, inflation, and loss of confidence amongst consumers and buyers. Let's have a look at the United States, and this is more dramatic. So the United States, although less directly affected by the war in Ukraine than Europeans, US imports during the second half of 2022, I would say collapsed is not too strong a word. You can see it monthly. The red is 2022, the blue is 2021, and the overall figure was a 36% lower import into the United States during the second half of 2022 compared to the second half of 2021. Now, okay, Ukraine situation was a little bit different. It's still going on 4 years later, of course. If the war were to end quickly in the Middle East, perhaps the impact would be less. But don't underestimate the fact that 3 weeks delay can take 6 weeks to fix. So when you get containers out of place, vessels out of place, cargo out of place, it makes a big difference. Energy prices have the habit of going up quickly and falling slowly. Prices certainly at the pump or for home heating oil or for home gas or for industrial gas tend to fall a lot more slowly than they rise. So this will certainly have an impact. If we look at world consumption, world imports in the second half of 2022, you can see that although we did see a little bit of growth, we saw 2% growth, it was, with the exception of COVID, the slowest growth of any year since 2018. In fact, if we go back further, we'd see it was the slowest growth of any year since 2011. So it is going to impact, or is likely to impact, unless it's a very short event, it is likely to impact the level of imports this year. So I would rule out, in the event of a continuation of the war, the US war on Iran, if we were to see a continuation of that, I would rule out any recovery in US demand. I would rule out fast growth in European Union, and clearly the Middle East, Central Asian markets are going to be highly compromised by that. This can change the picture if it goes on. So let's have a look at our demand outlooks, 2026 early factors. And this is a mix of the positive and the rather alarming. So initially, buyers are slower, but not lower. So what I'm saying is they're slower to come to the market, but there was no indication that the volumes they would buy would be any lower than last year. Growth in India, watch out for the tariff situation on tree nuts from the United States. We were seeing a relatively stable market with price resistance just below the current market price. So buyers were there if they could get their price. If the standoff lasts long enough, probably buyers pay the price. Vietnamese processors, forgive me, but I'm going to say they appear to have regained their composure. I think there was a little bit of panic last week. They started to sell a bit aggressively for whatever reason. Didn't see that later in the week. European supermarkets reducing prices could spike demand. That's true. That's recent. We've seen the discounters do it. Others will probably follow. We need to look at the US dollar. Now we're getting into the impact of this conflict. The US dollar has reversed. It's stronger. That could bring buyers in now, but could reduce demand over the course of the year. There is less room for volatility in the market, but the biggest factor this morning is conflict. Conflict is impacting energy prices. It could cause a reversal in economies. It could undermine consumer confidence. We've seen that that is brittle in the US. We've seen that it is returning, but nonetheless could be challenged in Europe. We've seen that if the war continues for a long time, that it'll be impossible to export to Central Asia or to the Middle East, and this could strongly reverse demand. So whereas we have a picture on production that is becoming clearer and clearer, and generally speaking positive, we now have the rather positive outlook that was on demand up to last week thrown into doubt by recent events. I'm going to update you on this again in 2 weeks. We will focus again on these factors and how demand is going. But for now, let's go back to Ernest and see if we've got any comments or any questions. Ernest.
Thank you very much, Jim Fitzpatrick. Before I go to the questions, let me remind you that the next ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo is taking place here in Accra, Ghana, from 22nd to 25th of September this year. So please block your calendars for that. I have Rohit who is asking, as it's already some good weeks and new crops have started in West Africa, he's also realizing that yet Vietnam buyers are very silent. and not yet coming into the market. And so now there's no sign of any quantity of RCN in the farm gate, let me put it that way. So is this a sign that the crop is not as good as expected? That is his question. Your mic, Jim. Your mic, very good, Jim.
Okay, thanks for the question. I'm guessing that question was asked early in the discussion. Farm gate prices, processors are buying in West Africa. They're buying lower quality, but they're buying reasonable volumes. Crop is probably not as good as was hoped for, but it's certainly not a bad crop. And I think that we shouldn't conclude that right now. The lack of Vietnamese buyers is entirely predictable. At this point, they will obviously come to market at some point. But they've got Cambodian nuts to buy. They've got a good crop at home. They've got some stocks in the warehouse. It's going to be a bit of a standoff for the immediate future, unless we see something that shifts kernel prices. Ernest.
Okay, we also have Knitting, and let me read what it says. Top of the morning to you, Jim. My apologies, I've sent these questions earlier, but I wasn't able to attend to hear your efforts. Perspectives needing clarity. There is a general feeling that the quality is about £2 lower compared to last year. People are talking about a smaller crop. Are these rooted in fact, or is it just the usual rumor? Additionally, please elaborate on the crop cycle and trade cycle for Gambia, Mali, and Senegal. I know those are yet to come in as well. Are we seeing any more logistical policies or bottlenecks that can stop inflow into this particular West African region? Jim?
Okay, it's too early to talk about Senegal, the Gambia,
Sure.
and that part of the world. That's why we don't talk about it yet. We'll come to that in the coming weeks. Top of the morning to you. Top of the morning is an American greeting. Thank you. I think that the crop, if we take Ivory Coast, for example, if we just compare quality to last year, definitely quality is lower. If we compare quality to average quality in recent years, it's not that much lower. Last year was an exceptional year. I was trying to make that clear in the course of the discussion. So yes, certainly the quality is lower than last year. That certainly means fewer kernels. Does it mean a lower crop overall? It probably does. But so we're dealing here with fact. So we're dealing with comparison with average, comparison with demand. We're dealing with the expectation. So if a government comes out and says our crop is 1.6 million tons and somebody says, I don't think it is, I think it's 1.4 million tons, is that a crop failure? No, it's not. That means several things. First of all, the initial forecast was overly optimistic. Secondly, that it's a crop of 1.4 million tons, a good crop. It is a great crop. So let's get some perspective on this. And we need to be really careful the way the message is portrayed. So quality is down is a fact. There's another way to say it. For Cote d'Ivoire, at least, you could say quality is average. It's average of the last 10 years, and that's probably not far from the truth. If you look at Ghana, on the other hand, if you say this year quality is down, it's probably true as well. But if you say quality is below average, that is probably also true. So in that case, you would say that you can't go along saying that there's a big quality problem across West Africa. What we're seeing is variations. So from a buyer's point of view, and a raw cashew nut buyer's point of view, you buy what you see in front of you. It's always tested anyway. Very few people would buy simply on contract or promises from their supplier. They'll test the product, they'll check the product, they'll build in allowances. On the other hand, if you're a processor, this is tough because it completely changes your economics of processing. It changes your outturn, it changes your costs. So it's a very tough thing to manage. However, in countries like Cote d'Ivoire, we're talking about quality that we've experienced previously. So we've seen this in 2022, we've seen it in 2023, to a lesser extent in 2024. So is this crop as good as last year? I think this is the conclusive statement we can make. Is it as good as last year? No. Is it as big as last year? Possibly. Is it as good quality as last year on what we know right now? Definitely not. Where are we in the season? We're only about 30% in, so all of these factors can change for the better or for the worse over the next couple of months. So keep a close eye, look for the hype, be careful what you read in terms of social media posts. Always check the source, always question, always look for more information. Ernest.
Jim, the last part of the question was on the logistical policies and bottlenecks that could stop inflow from West Africa. If you could touch on that bit also.
It's likely that voyage times will get longer. It's likely that freight rates will increase. But whether there will be any significant bottlenecks remains to be seen. Obviously, if you can't go through, if at some point you couldn't go through the Suez Canal, that's going to have a big impact.
Yeah.
But for now, we're not seeing that. So look for disruption. This is much more disruption on oil shipments, and it depends. These. I don't like talking about war too much, but it's not my business. It's not my expertise. But some of these conflicts come and go very quickly. If that's the case, the impact is limited. If it goes on for a long time, obviously we're going to see a major impact. We just need to keep a close eye on it. I don't think that it is a good time to make snap judgments, reactions. I don't think it's a good time to speculate because these are factors that can change very quickly.
Thank you. All right, from Giresh, is referencing the good crop in Cambodia and Vietnam and wants to know whether it will make any impact on the prices of RCN in West Africa.
Yeah, it'll bring buyers from Vietnam later. If it brings them later, it probably means they come a little bit lower in price. As I said, I think RCN prices in West Africa are a bit too high at the moment, not in all countries, but in some countries. Yeah, I think raw cashew nut prices will come down.
You've talked about the consumption in Europe. The question I have next is, are there any growth trends on organic cashew consumption in Europe? Or is there just a broader consumption picture that has already been mentioned? I know you talked about the consumption generally, yes.
I think that organic consumption is increasing in Europe. It's interesting, if we look back to 2022, and I'm drawing that comparison because we had similar circumstances politically at that moment. In 2022, in the second half of the year, organic consumption was heavily impacted by inflation, higher prices, and generally speaking by consumers, particularly in Germany, tightening their belts. This time round, we see positive growth in organic consumption since then. We've seen good demand. We've seen much more complex rules, which limits the number of suppliers that can meet organic demand. I think for well-qualified suppliers with the right certification, the right approach, and the right marketing, this can continue to be a really good year for the supply of organic products. In essence, there's more demand than there is supply. Sometimes that isn't seen simply because for new products, for new product launches, there just isn't enough product to launch them, so that the launches are slow. But if we look in mainstream supermarkets in Europe, we're increasingly seeing organic cashew nuts, we're increasingly seeing organic tree nuts, and I think it's going to be positive. Now, that does not mean that it's going to take over the world, far from it. The market share, it's difficult to judge, it's between 4 and 6%, so it remains relatively small, but growing quickly. So I'm positive on organic products. Be honest, I think that it's going to be more difficult to find good suppliers, properly certified suppliers of organic cashew nuts in the future. And building relationships with good suppliers, well certified now, is important from the buyer's perspective. And I think you can see that in the, if you go to a trade fair like Biofac, if you go to Anuga last year, you'll see that really positive trend.
Sure. Thank you, Jim. The last question is from Saravana on our Facebook page, and it's a tricky one. Why is RCN price increasing? And I'm sure it's in reference to West Africa. What is driving RCN prices and with a trend of an increase over the years?
Yeah, it's a good point. It's a good question. So RCN prices are higher this year. I think they're higher because of the perception that there was a problem with the crop and because demand last year was so good. I don't think that that will last. As I was saying, I think that we will see um, I think that we will see an easing of raw cashew nut prices. And I think we'll see that because volumes will be there. It is a difficult one to judge because bear in mind that when we look at price, we also have to take into account quality. So if we look at the outturn that's being offered, we need to relate that to price. I don't see upward pressure on raw cashew nut prices at the moment. On the contrary, I see a little bit of downward pressure. I think give it a week or two, we might see prices start to ease. Now, I'm not talking about a major collapse in prices. What I'm saying is that I think these prices don't work right now, and therefore they need to be corrected. What could increase raw cashew nut prices? I suppose some kind of dramatic intervention from some government to ban exports. We've seen it before, but I don't think we're going to see it this year.
Sure.
Ernest.
All right. Also from Antoinette on Facebook, it is good to produce in large quantities and export, but what do farmers gain from this? And then she goes on to say, I think the best joint action we can take is to help these farmers by buying their produce at a fair price. So more or less, what are farmers gaining from all these huge exports that are going out? And then what about fair prices?
Well, I think, if we look at the type of farm families that grow cashew nuts, we're talking about some of the poorest people. They are all smallholders. Their income from cashew nuts is important. The use of that income is critical for them. And over the last 10 or 15 years, they have received fairer prices, or at least higher prices. Do they receive a fair share of, let's say, the retail price in a supermarket in a Western country? Probably not. Should that be done in a different way? I wouldn't argue that it should. Can it be done is more complex. To do it, I think you need processing at origin as the first step. I think you need an integrated supply chain. We're entering a period where I believe that supply will exceed demand for the next 5 years, possibly for the next 10 years, in years of normal crops. That could pressurize prices at the farm gate significantly. Farmers' answer to this problem traditionally has been to grow more. So, generally speaking, if we look in West Africa, what we've seen is West Africa driving production of cashew nuts in the world for the last 20 years, with the exception of a couple of years when Cambodia took over that role. So farmers plant more, they do earn more money by planting more, but if prices are low, that becomes marginal. Now, within the challenges of climate change, we're going to see that that problem becomes more and more acute. And I think I would agree that we all have a role to reward farmers more fairly for what they do. But we also need to find a market mechanism to make that work. The idea that we should just reward them fairly is good, but put that into business. Make that work for a roaster, make it work for a consumer in a consuming country, whether that be India or whether it be the United States. That's the difficult thing. There have been mechanisms. Fair trade is one, but it hasn't really caught on in terms of the volume. The volumes remain fairly light. We need to find a better, more widespread, applicable way. And I think this is one of the tasks. I am worried for the fate of cashew farmers because I see production growing. I see consumption growing. We talked about it today, production growing at around 7%, consumption growing at about 4.75. The potential for a interruption in that trend in 2026. This does need to be fixed and we need to do it. And I agree that unless we reward farmers fairly, not only does that represent a threat to their livelihoods, but it represents a threat to their survival in a time of climate change. It means more migration to the cities. It means more interest in emigration. It means more unrest. It potentially means political instability. And let's face it, cashew growing has been a force for good in many West African countries in particular, but also in East Africa. But it hasn't been a smooth journey. And that really needs to be looked at and it needs to be addressed, especially as we enter a time when we're likely to see real prices lower than they are today over the next 5 to 10 years. Great question. I wish I could answer it in more detail, and I'd like to talk about it with you at some stage. Thanks very much indeed. Ernest.
It's more greetings from Florentino Nanki. We are going to be going to Guinea-Bissau maybe in the coming weeks. And we know that the season is beginning to start somewhere there. But greetings to all of them in Guinea-Bissau, Gambia, Senegal. We will be touching your area very soon. Jim, the next GME is scheduled for the 18th of this month, March. What should we expect in between now and the 18th?
I think we need to look, between now and the 18th, we need to look at the developing situation. We need to look at the rainfall patterns in West Africa. We need to look at the emerging quality situation. We need to look at whether or not kernels buyers enter the market. We need to look at freight, oil prices, gas prices. This is getting complex. I think with that in mind, when it comes to our next event, I'm going to again look at markets and crops. We might look a little bit further west in West Africa. We'll have more information from Cambodia, Vietnam, and from India too. And we'll have some indications on the impact on market sentiment. And that's often a really important factor, sometimes above and beyond the reality of supply and demand. We'll have a look at the market sentiment as it evolves with these conflicts going on around the world. Interesting times. And clearly people find them interesting because I just noticed on the Zoom today, we hit a record number of people joining. I want to thank everyone for that.
Exactly.
And thanks to the sponsors who support this event,
including
you, Ernest. Thanks very much.
Hey, thank you, Jim, as always. And well prepared, good information. And we look forward to having you on the 18th. And to the participants, thank you for showing up. And to Cashew Club, EU, OACPS, SNI, thanks so much for the support you continue to give. And bye-bye to everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Stay safe. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.